Let me make a couple of preliminary remarks about why such a seminar or why such a discussion, and a little bit about the format, and then we'll plunge into the discussion. Um, there's an My wife and I travel quite often to Asia, and we've been to China 4 or 5 times. And one of the great ironies that we have seen is that many Chinese people, particularly intellectuals, academics, are asking for answers to why Europe was able to achieve such a high level of civilization, fully aware, of course, of the great periods of darkness. Nevertheless, in terms of human rights, healthcare, rise of modern science, and they are quite aware that the Judeo-Christian heritage, and specifically um, the biblical heritage, are intertwined with Europe's achievements. And the times that we've been, and I've spent quite a bit of time in the major universities, they want to know what's the connection. So I have my little thoughts on that. And the irony is that often in the West at this time, we are cynical or worse about much of Western tradition. And I, like many of my generation, grew up really reticent about the claims of the Western canon and colonization and all of those things. And I think rightly so in the era after the Second World War, with decolonization and with the awareness of the increasing importance of the Southern Hemisphere and of non-European parts of the planet, we've tended to downplay the Western canon and look at other traditions with a new eye. We've discovered marvelous things. Even in my realm of theology, which has been heavily dominated by the West, there's all kinds of new attention, properly so, to non-Western theologies. And we're discovering emphases that we hadn't seen that are in Scripture because of that. Nevertheless, the pendulum always swings to extremes, and I think there's a great danger of, as the expression goes, throwing out the baby with the bathwater when we reject some of the Western canon. And so I thought today we might look again at some of the great texts that have defined the West, or at least the Western consciousness. And as you can see, these are not simply pro-Christian, pro-humanist, pro-Western, pro-colonial. A number of them are rather quite critical of that and suggest another way. For want of a better way of organizing these 3 hours together, I've grouped them into 3 series of 2. Augustine's Confessions and Camus' The Fall, which is, as you know, a kind of confession. And looking at these as representing 2 worldviews out of which a particular kind of confession comes. One early on in the history of the West, and one in late modernity. 2 from the dawn of modernity, quite different as well. Machiavelli, the prince, coming out of the emerging city-states and the need to reflect polity and governance in a Renaissance atmosphere. And then, yeah, come on in, go into the circle, don't sit in the back. And the other, one of the classic texts of the Reformation, one of the 3 great masterpieces of Martin Luther from 1520, The Freedom of the Christian. And then 2 which wrestle with the issue of, can you be good without God? Classic, of course, issue. Dostoevsky, the famous Grand Inquisitor passage from the brothers Karamazov, and then Nietzsche's 3:125, the poem on the madman from The Gay Science. So it seems to me we can have a better understanding of how Europeans look at life and perhaps open the way to see a better way for the gospel to be spread in Europe with all of its variety, with this heritage and these very European ways of inquiry in our background. So my hope, my great hope, I know that not all of you have these texts in front of you, is that this will be an inductive discussion and will not be me lecturing. I don't want to do that, and it would be counterproductive, because I want these things to emerge out of the text. And your comments, these are so many words on a page until people enliven them with their thoughts. And I think it can go anywhere we want. Applications, I can ask some diagnostic questions. So I hope that you're comfortable with that. Now, let's begin then with Augustine and Camus. And I'll just say a few words of introduction. Most of us know this extremely well. So Augustine was born in 354, and he died in 430 of the Christian era. I consider him a hinge figure. He was at the apex of the early church period, but very much a hinge into the early Middle Ages. And surely the greatest theologian since the Apostle Paul, and maybe the greatest theologian of all time. Some people would claim Thomas Aquinas or John Calvin or Karl Barth. There's many who shine very brightly, but certainly no one would ignore Augustine in importance in the outworking of theology. From the Confessions, we know a little bit about his story, and that's the purpose as today is to look at that, so I'm not going to say anything about his biography. But he was an apologist par excellence. And it's been said that one of the main reasons he wrote The City of God was to respond to the challenge that the Roman nobility was making to Christians when Rome was being sacked and attacked by these northern hordes, the Goths, the Visigoths, who, by the way, were Christians, although Arian Christians, so very marginally Christians. But it was considered unthinkable that the city, the eternal city that had been impregnable for at least 7 centuries, could have been so devastated by these barbarian hordes. And when in a situation like that, you have to blame somebody. Every time there's a huge catastrophe, you turn around and blame someone. They blamed the Christians because, as you know, in the ancient world, it was thought that every city, every village was protected by at least one god. And Rome was protected by a pantheon of gods, with the greatest of all the gods in the pantheon. And when Christians came to Rome, they confessed a God who would not be in the pantheon. He wouldn't play ball with them. And because he claimed to be the creator of all. And so they wouldn't participate in ceremonies, pagan ceremonies that did homage to the gods in order to get jobs or marry the right person or whatever. So, of course, the reason that Rome was sacked, according to these critics, was that the gods would no longer protect the city because someone in the city was not behaving. So, in answer to this charge, Augustine writes one of the most powerful theological treatises of all time, The City of God. Long, thick volumes with a thoughtful, meandering critique of paganism. And as we read him, we learn more about the pagan views and the heretical views than we would if we read the pagans themselves, because he's very fair-minded. And his basic answer is, Christians, because they believe in a city to come, invest a good deal in the city of man, but in the right way. And so, we're not to blame. It's Roman paganism that's to blame. So he's just an amazing figure. And he wrote the Confessions somewhere between 397 and 398, when he was well into his Christian experience and wanted to reflect on how God had dealt with him through in his life. Albert Camus is something quite different in some ways. He was born in 1913. He died in 1960, tragically in a car accident outside of Lourmarin in southern France. He grew up in Algeria and always was a North African in his consciousness. He couldn't afford to go to Paris, which is what bright kids did in those days. So he went to the university in Algiers, and he shone brightly as a philosopher and a thinker. He eventually wrote a thesis, which became one of his major philosophical works, The Myth of Sisyphus. And the Myth of Sisyphus is important because he decides to open with a question that's very unusual in philosophical treatises. The question is not who is man, who is God, what's the earth, what are the categories of the spirit, but he said there's only one question worth asking: whether or not life is worth the trouble of being lived. And if you can answer that, then you can start to answer all the others. So it's the question of suicide. About 300 pages later, he decides it is, but not for the usual reasons. It's worth living because we must fight for justice. We must passionately oppose anyone who oppresses the weak, just because we should do it. No reason. Life is absurd. And so you can either just commit suicide, or you can get involved in the battle, which is what he chose to do. And he wrote The Fall, it's one of his last novels, in 1956. Jean-Paul Sartre, who was his sometime colleague and his sometime rival, declared it to be Camus' greatest piece of work. And it's an unusual piece of work because it's not strictly a novel. It's an account. It's kind of a confession in his relationship to this confessor that he meets in Amsterdam. So, let's plunge into this. In the most general and obvious terms, describe some of the similarities and some of the main differences of these two texts. Who is the more honest? Or are they equally honest in their own different ways? So, over to you. Just similarities, differences. How could we dare compare a 20th century text, to a 4th century text with any kind of integrity?